In the summer of 2020, many companies rolled out diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts in the wake of the George Floyd protests. But let's take a look at where those efforts stand now 2 years later. We also, of course, have just passed Juneteenth, where we saw a lot of examples of companies putting out Juneteenth-themed products. But again, is there a disconnect between that public-facing image and what companies are actually doing in terms of racial justice? Let's bring in Shaun Harper. He's a provost professor at the USC Marshall School of Business. Shaun, thank you so much for being here. Let's take the Juneteenth example first. Companies got a lot of attention for Juneteenth-themed products that they were coming out with that didn't necessarily reflect the spirit of the holiday, although you could also argue that commercialization of holidays is in a grand American tradition, I suppose, for better and for worse. What did you make of some of those offerings?
Sure. Well, first off, thanks for having me. Let me just say that on the one hand, I so appreciate that Juneteenth is finally a national, federally recognized holiday. But on the other hand, I think it is so important for companies and for the broader public to understand what Juneteenth is, and that it is not the kind of holiday to be commercialized like we have done with Valentine's Day and Halloween, for example. You know, they're just such important, rich cultural traditions that are a part of Juneteenth that have to be honored. I think that if business leaders actually took the time to first learn about Juneteenth on their own, but also to actually invite the input of their Black employees, they would have known that, these ridiculous, efforts to commercialize the holiday were inappropriate and for some actually really offensive.
So let's talk about some of the work then that companies are doing to create more of that conversation, but more of the not just inclusion, but equity along the way as well within that. We were just taking a look at two of the companies that you've worked with, Nike, as well as Google, and across and over the past 2 years. We've seen some of those efforts play out. Who are the companies that are doing it well right now, and where are we still seeing some of these efforts fall flat?
Sure. I'm so glad you asked me this question. I am so incredibly proud of Nike and its executives. Nike was not just one of the companies that posted a statement on its website and sent it to its employees following the murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor. It wasn't just a company that made a multi-million-dollar pledge and, investment of its resources into racial justice and racial equity efforts. But they also did the work internally, and they're continuing to do the work with lots of professional learning and skill building among its leaders and all 75,000 of its employees. And I can say so declaratively because they're doing that work with us here at the USC Race and Equity Center. It's deep, it's substantive, it's real. I just wish that there would be so many other companies that would seize the opportunity to actually be better and to act with integrity. I'm so disappointed by the number of companies that made these splashy pledges back in June 2020, $1 billion here, multi-million dollars there. So much of that money remains uncommitted. It remains unspent. So in other words, it was a lie, right? Like those companies lied to the American public. They lied to their Black employees about their commitment to racial equity and racial justice. The good news is that it's not too late to make good on those promises. I want to see more companies do what Nike did and step up and lead with integrity.
What do you think is holding those companies back? In other words, do you think that they lied sort of wanting to put out the good image, not really with any intention of following through? Do you think it's just a lack of the will to make the changes happen? Do you think it's sort of the excuse of, well, we don't know how to do it? Obviously, there are lots of resources to figure out how to do it. Why do you think there has been this gap?
Yeah, I think it's a cocktail, honestly, of all of those factors. I remember in June 2020 when there were protests all across the United States and indeed around the world following the murder of George Floyd. So many companies were, very urgently, reaching out to me and my colleagues here at the USC Race and Equity Center, very desperately asking for guidance and for help. My sense is that, many companies were inspired by the moment. But let's be clear, they were also being pushed by their Black employees in a way that they had not been previously pushed, right? So in other words, many Black professionals in companies across industries in June 2020 was saying that we don't just have a problem with systemic racism in policing, but we have it here too in our workplace. And, we're demanding that our company leverage its resources, all of its assets to finally do something about workplace racism. So my sense is that a lot of companies just very haphazardly, just sort of threw out a commitment without a real strategy or plan for how to actualize that commitment.
I need to hustle to my finish, and I only have about 30 seconds here, but want to get your perspective, especially on the employment situation front. We know that the unemployment rate for Black Americans is double that of the national average, 6.2% versus 3.6% nationally. So thinking through how we are navigating a perhaps impending recession or one that is being felt right now on the employment front, how do we ensure that there is not this disparity that is exacerbated?
Sure. We should not do what we have done in previous moments of economic distress where we've discarded, Black and brown employees in our workforce. We have to be incredibly intentional with a race salient strategy to ensure that we don't leave, millions of Black and brown workers behind. This would be one way that those companies that made those splashy billion-dollar and multi-million-dollar investments, this could be one way that they could, very smartly spend those dollars to help relieve some of that economic stress.
Provost Professor at USC Marshall School of Business, Shaun Harper, thanks so much for joining us. We appreciate the conversation.